So the city looks to buy rent-controlled buildings at risk of demolition. And this article came out not that long ago. There's also issues of rent control here in the Los Angeles area, and a lot of times you won't hear about these things on the news. They will sometimes leave, or most often leave these things out unless you look in a local paper in your city or your neighborhood. And so the city looks to buy rent-controlled buildings at risk of demolition. It might get the first right of refusal. Okay, so this is by Jenna Chandler, and this was in November of 2019. So there wasn't much really discussed about this, and maybe it was, but it wasn't highly publicized. Maybe it was briefly publicized. So the council member, Gil Cedillo, says that LA needs to come up with solutions to keep our fellow Angelenos in their homes and stop the flow into homelessness. And so this contributes to the homeless issue, having more housing that people can actually pay rent and not have to pay high rents that they can't afford to live in these units. And so that is what has been a growing problem in Los Angeles, Inglewood, and sister neighboring cities. So if an owner wants to demolish a rent-controlled building, should the city of Los Angeles or the tenants get the opportunity to buy it first? That is the question. So Los Angeles City Council Housing Committee endorsed the idea on Wednesday. It was proposed by Council Member Herb Wesson, who wrote in the motion that we need to come up with solutions to keep our fellow Angelenos in their homes and stop the flow into homelessness. Why? Because the first of right of refusal would come into play when a property owner files and what is called the Ellis Act application. That's the state law that allows landlords to withdraw their property from rent control, either because they plan to demolish it or remove it permanently from rental housing use, typically to convert to condos or for sale units. According to the Coalition of Economic Survival, property owners have applied to strip 1,348 rental units from rent controlled under the Ellis Act so far this year. So large developers and land speculators have taken advantage of the Ellis Act by purchasing rent-controlled buildings, evicting the tenants, and replacing existing buildings with market-rate luxury development, upscale condominiums, and non-rental commercial uses. Wesson's motion says. So this is why, or this is a majority of why, people who lived in what was once affordable rent units, where you were paying maybe $600 or maybe $800 a month or $900 a month, or you had been there for years and you were paying under $1,000, you're now looking at, if you want to move in what they call quote unquote luxury apartments, $2,000 or more than $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 or even $5,000 a month just to live. And a lot of people that are regular families do not make that kind of money. You have some people who are single who don't make that kind of money unless they work 2 and 3 jobs, depending on what their occupation is. So regular people who make the regular living wage may not make can make rent of $2,000 and $3,000 a month. That may be more than a third of what their income is. So beyond that, it's unclear how exactly the proposal would work. Okay, so under the proposal, either the city, the tenants, or the mission-driven affordable housing developers would be given the option to buy the property instead. So it says it's unclear how the proposal would work. The Housing Committee is asking the full council to to task the Housing and Community Investment Department and City Attorney with drafting an ordinance that would provide more detail. So this sounds like a terrific idea to me, Councilmember Paula Krikorian, who serves on the Housing Committee. But he said that he wanted to learn more about the potential advantages and disadvantages and the risk also. So our council has the tendency to not think ordinances through. He said representatives from 2 local land trusts said it would bolster their effort in keeping property affordable within the control of communities. So our neighborhood has a lot of rent-controlled buildings, said Robert Garcia in East LA of Community Corp, but we want to make sure that if their buildings are sold, they have access to buy it. So in the letter, the Housing Committee Chair, Damian Godman, a community organizer in the Crenshaw area, said that it would give the city the opportunity to replace exploited for-profit owners with owners dedicated to preserving housing unit affordability. And so that's what our huge problem is here in the Los Angeles area. We have a lot of exploitive for-profit owners who are trying to replace the dedicated owners who want to preserve housing for affordability for families and community type people. So passing the motion would preserve the number of affordable units for poor and working class Angelenos and spare tenants the traumatic process of eviction and harassment, he wrote. So that's what's been going on. A lot of these people who have now become the growing number of new population of homeless people are just working class people, poor people who just don't make money that they can pay 2 and 3K a month in rent. It's unreal. And a lot of these for-profit owners, they're just about the money, not about the people in the community, and that is why you see more people on the street. It is not just mental illness. There is mental illness. Yes, there is drugs, but that is not all of the homeless population. So the news does not always tell you everything in detail. And so I wanted to say that because I live here in Los Angeles and I know what I see, and I've heard people who said that they work, they're not on drugs, but they just cannot afford 2 and 3K a month in rent. And so that is the reason why you have more people on the street, because they simply cannot afford the rent. So this is one of the reasons why there's so much homelessness. So the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles and the California Apartment Association opposed the proposal. So it would restrict unfairly encumbered mom and pop property owners, said Danielle Liebner, Peretz, director of the government affairs of the Apartment Association of Greater Los Angeles. So in a letter to the committee, she said it is unnecessarily delaying the potential sale of property or discouraging potential buyers from making a purchase offer in the first place. So Lidner Pertz urged the council to focus instead on policies and incentives to encourage more housing production as a solution to the city's housing crisis and shortage. So they claim there's a housing crisis and shortage, but a lot of it is property that has been here in Los Angeles for years. People see their eye on it and they want to make money off of it and change it into a condominium, or they want to turn it into a luxury apartment and they want to make a lot of money off of it. And then people who just don't make enough money are not able to live in those units, or they cannot afford it, or they can't put a down payment on it. And there are stipulations behind all of that. And so this is what has not been reiterated more in many times. And so they might be units that look simple like this, and they want to tear them down and turn them into something else like a condo. Also, I was looking at It says, are you paying too much in rent even in a rent-controlled apartment? And so this is out of Curbed LA. I wanted to add this in here. So it goes, are you paying too much rent for a rent-controlled apartment? Okay, so a new report from UCLA says it's time to rethink how much landlords can hike rents. So this is another issue that has been going. This is by Jenna Chandler. This is more recent at December 3rd, 2019 of this year. And so look at how this building looks. This is in LA, a typical building in LA, and it has many units. So most Angelenos can't afford market rate housing. It's just as I said, the inflation rate averaged 14%, or 1.4%, that is, from 2010 to 2018. But in that time period, the city has allowed landlords to increase rent by 3% every year. And so most Angelenos can't afford market rate housing in their neighborhoods, but even the rent control apartments tenants might be paying way too much in rent. So a new brief from UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy finds that the amount that the landlords are allowed to raise rents in the city has outpaced inflation for more than a decade. So the inflation rate has remained below 3% every year from 2010 to 2018, averaging 1.4%. But in the time period, the city has allowed landlords to increase rent by 3% every year. The paper's Arthur Shane Phillips crunched the numbers and found that the tenant who moved into a $1,200 a month apartment in 2009 might be paying $1,628 per month in 2018 instead of $1,411. And the tenant who moved in to a $1,500 a month apartment as recently as 2015 could be paying $100 less a month if rent increases were tied directly to the inflation rate. As Phillips notes that the large sum of many households in Los Angeles, according to census data, 43% of households earn less than $50,000 a year in 2018. So while these numbers may sound small, the consequences for low-income renters have not been, writes Phillips, who manages the Lewis Center's housing initiatives. At a very least, the time seems ripe for policymakers to reevaluate LA rent stabilization ordinance and its minimum allowable rent increases. So the Apartment Association of Greater LA agrees that it's time to reevaluate how much landlords are allowed to raise rents, but using inflation commonly measured by the Consumer's Price Index isn't fair to building owners, says Executive Director Daniel Yulkson. So CPI is not a measure of the cost of maintaining a rental property. It is the measure of how much consumer goods are increasing, he says. So price controls are strict enough already, Yulkson says, and they're driving mom and pop landlords out of business. And so the membership has started to become a leaky bucket in terms of long-term members, he says. So they just want out. Inflation, he says, doesn't factor costs that are unique to landlords, such as property insurance, taxes, and utilities. So operating expenses shot up to 4.7% last year in LA, and more than any other metro area, according to the survey by the National Apartment Association, which puts the blame on the cost of the salaries and personnel as well as taxes. So Yulkson says that the city should do cost studies to determine how much rent can go up. So instead, LA rounds CPI, a cost per income, shoots up 12%. The most landlords can hike rent is 8%. Okay, so that's at the most. If, on the other hand, the CPI grows to 1.2%, rent increases for up to about 3% are allowed. So California's new rent control law, which will take effect January 1st, as I said, and impact apartments not already covered by local rent control laws, will allow landlords to hike their rents by 5% plus regional inflation. So legislation was designed to protect against egregious rent increases. So a separate analysis CoStar released last month finds that it's also unlikely that the control rent growth in the lower half of the market and the residents most in need of affordable housing are unlikely to benefit from it. So anti-gouging protects against the most dramatic headline making rent increases, but it won't do much at all for the people who are falling behind a little bit more each year, Phillips says. So if you're already paying high rent, it might not do as much to stop what's already happening unless you move to a place where the rent is cheaper or your income changes some type of way dramatically. You make more money, which doesn't always happen for everybody. And so I wanted to add that in there because a lot of times when they talk about the issues about homelessness, they fail to mention some of the other underlying problems. They almost always say, oh, it's mental illness. It isn't only or solely mental illness. A lot of this has to do with people who are simply working class poor who just cannot afford the rent increases and the rent hikes, and these greedy landlords that are here in Los Angeles and these metropolitan cities, even outside of Los Angeles, who are raising the rents or who are profiting off of people not really being able to afford. They just want people who are able to just dump more money into these units, and you don't really benefit from it. It's somebody that's behind it that owns the units that benefits mostly from it. There are more egregious rent hikes and more for-profit landlords or slumlords even. You have some slumlords who they might install something new and now they want to raise the rent to market rate rent, which they haven't really been good about fixing things in building and they're negligent. And it takes forever to take them to court, and you have to go through a process or a series just to get them to fix anything. You might get threatened if you don't pay the rent, or if you're a few days behind on the rent, they're harassing you. You also have tenants who are being harassed by landlords over being a day or two or maybe a week or two because they can't wait for you to get a paycheck. You might get paid every 2 weeks. Maybe you don't get paid every week. So it's really sad. So that is what is going on. That's what the news does not cover. Real lives of people who are really struggling just to make ends meet, just to pay the bills and rent each month, just to survive and live. With that being said, thanks for listening.